So tonight this is a series on sacred texts. Last week, Albert looked at the Jewish texts, the Hebrew Bible, and a lot of the commentaries. And that's what it's important in this series, to realize that religions have their sacred texts, but they're often commentaries that far outnumber the text itself. And so tonight we're going to be looking at one of the Hindu sacred texts known as the Bhagavad Gita. But to put it in context, let's just take a look at the numerous texts found in the Hindu tradition. There's not just one, there are many. So the earliest texts are known as the Vedas. And the Vedas appeared roughly around 1600 BCE, 1500, 1600. Tradition says they go back hundreds of thousands of years, but that's what tradition often does, pushes it way back. What's the idea there? The earlier, the better. But in any case, most scholars have the Vedas about 1500 BC. These were hymns to various gods, polytheistic, as well as specific rituals for sacrifice. Over 1,000 hymns just in the Vedas alone. You can see there are the four main Vedas. So it's a large text. Then around 600 BCE, we get another group of texts known as the Upanishads. These texts were much more philosophical in nature. They were asking such questions as the nature of ultimate reality, the nature of the soul, the nature of the relationship of the soul to ultimate reality. And they were usually, Upanishad means sitting at the foot of. That means the students were sitting at the foot of the guru, who was then reciting his notions about ultimate reality. So those appear about 600 BCE. And there are a lot of these. There's 10 major Upanishads, but they're up to 30. So you can see the corpus of sacred text expanding already. Then around 400 BC, we have another group of texts, usually known as the epics. These have a lot of historical information in them, as well as sacred stories. This is just one volume of the great epic known as the Mahabharata. Maha means great in Sanskrit. Bharat is India, so it's the great story of India, the Mahabharata. 18 million words just in this epic, this one epic. That's only one volume. There's like 30 volumes. So you can see if you want to know sacred texts in Hinduism, you've got a lifetime job. And the Bhagavad Gita, which we'll be looking at tonight, is one of the books in the Mahabharata. It's one of the chapters in the Mahabharata. Then we have a group of texts known as the Puranas. These come later, somewhere between 200 BCE and 400 CE. And these have numerous stories about different gods, different traditions. These are the most popular texts. These are the texts that people know, because these are the texts that they hear. These are stories about various gods and heroes. And this is just one of the Puranas here, and there are like 30 of them. So if you put that all together, you can see you're dealing with a vast corpus of sacred texts that have evolved over the centuries. In addition to those, then there are the commentaries. Those are the texts. Then you get commentaries on all of these. Let me just give you an example. Here's the Bhagavad Gita, the text. Here's the commentary. Okay.
Just like a Bible commentary.
Yeah, right. Just like as Albert was pointing out last week, you have the Hebrew Bible, then you have the commentaries, the Mishra and the Talmud, etc. Same thing. That's because people like to reflect on these and discuss what they think they mean. And that's what we're going to do tonight. So we're going to have our own sort of commentary on the Gita. So let's now move to the Gita. So Gita, or Bhagavad Gita, can be translated as Song of the Lord. Gita means song in Sanskrit. Bhagavad is Lord, so Song of the Lord. Generally, you often just see it referred to as the Gita, but the title is the Bhagavad Gita. It's a 700-verse scripture It is part of this ancient epic that I mentioned before, the Mahabharata. It has been praised by such prominent individuals as Mahatma Gandhi, Aldous Huxley, Henry David Thoreau, Albert Einstein, J. Robert Oppenheimer, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Carl Jung, Hermann Hesse. It's a very popular text. In fact, in terms of the West, most people think this is the Hindu text. If you ask them, what's the Hindu text, they'd say the Bhagavad Gita. Well, it's one small text in a vast corpus of text. So we're going to look at it a little. This is what Gandhi said of it. He held it personally as his favorite text. He said, when doubts haunt me, when disappointments stare me in the face, and I see not one ray of hope on the horizon, I turn to the Bhagavad Gita and find a verse to comfort me. And I immediately begin to smile in the midst of overwhelming sorrow. Those who meditate on the Gita will derive fresh joy and new meanings from it every day. He also said, my life has been full of external tragedies, and if they have not left any visible effect on me, I owe it to the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. So from its contents, it's very clear that this text has been influenced by the earlier Upanishads, which I mentioned, those texts that ask the big questions. Who am I? What's this all about? What's the ultimate reality? And Buddhism. It's been impacted by both because it appears after Buddhism in India. Theories as to the date of the Gita, they're all over the place, but most modern scholars accept somewhere between the 5th and 2nd century BCE. So it's before the Christian era. Although it didn't take its final form till about the 3rd century CE. So what does that tell you that's happening with a text over time? It's changing. And all religious texts do that. We can trace them because we have earlier copies, etc. Modern scholars believe it was written by a number of individuals, so it probably wasn't just one individual who wrote this. But traditionally, again, this is tradition, it's ascribed to a gentleman by the name of Vyasa. He's sort of like a Homer figure in Greek literature, probably more of a mythical figure, but he's also said to have written the entire Mahabharata. Okay. As well as another epic. So take that for what it's worth. So the story recounts the travails of princely brothers, 5 princely brothers, known as the Pandavas, who have lost their kingdom due to the wiles of their evil cousins, the Kauravas. Hindu literature is often very melodramatic. There's good and there's evil, and it's pretty clear what's what. Okay, so here are the Pandavas, who represent righteousness and goodness, and the Kauravas. And the section of the Gita begins while the armies are lined up against each other to do battle. It's called the Battle of Kurukshetra. The reason they're fighting is the Pandavas lost their kingdom to the Kauravas because one of the brothers liked to gamble. And he slowly gambled away the entire kingdom. But the Kauravas were using loaded dice. So they got the kingdom sort of, in any case, they're supposed to give it back after 13 years, and now they refuse to give it back. So there's going to be a battle between the Kauravas and the Pandavas. And this is where the Bhagavad Gita comes into play. Because as the battle is about to begin, one of the youngest brothers, whose name is Arjuna, he's an acclaimed warrior. He now wonders how he could kill his own blood relatives with whom he has grown up. Okay? These are cousins. So there's one army lined up here, another, and he's supposed to go fight for righteousness, and suddenly he says what? I can't do this. So do you see what it's a big question about? When do you have the right to kill if you do. So it comes into, that's one of the underlying notions, and we'll look at that detail later. So this is what he says, and his charioteer is Krishna. See, you can see, Krishna is an incarnation of the god Vishnu, although Arjuna doesn't know it, okay, as the story unfolds. So Krishna is an incarnation like, say, Jesus is an incarnation in Hindu tradition. There's the god Vishnu. He's the human incarnation. He's driving the chariot. Arjuna doesn't want to fight. This is what Arjuna says. Oh, what avail to us are kingdoms, happiness, or even life itself, when all those for whom we desire them are now arrayed in the battlefield? Why should I wish to kill them, though I may survive? Sin will overcome us if we slay such an aggressor. Therefore, it is not proper for us to kill our friends and relatives. What should we gain, and how could we be happy by killing our own kinsmen? You see it's the vital question of war. Okay, the notion of why should, and if you want to take kinsmen as not just immediate relatives, but humanity, it's the big question of a just war. So his refusal to fight has put the battle on hold. The battle can't start. The great warrior is sitting down. And Krishna is acting as his charioteer, and the rest of the Gita is a dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna. Krishna is going to answer his question, but it's going to really expand into a whole process, 18 chapters worth of religious understanding of reality. Yep. Now, there are three main categories of teaching that Krishna gives to Arjuna. Pardon me? Three major types of teaching that he's going to give to Arjuna. Arjuna wants to know, when he asks that question, what are you really asking? What's it all about? Okay? And so he's now going to explain what it's all about. And there are three categories under which he has his explanations. The first is known as Jnana Yoga. Jnana means knowledge, in the sense of knowing, not like 1 and 1 is 2 or some historical fact, but knowing the ultimate truths about yourself and reality. Okay? When you have jnana knowledge, you know the truth with a capital T. So he's going to teach him this path. In the Gita, this applies to the nature of the soul or the true self, which is known as the Atman. So Krishna is going to teach Arjuna about his true self, which is called Atman, as well as the nature of reality or God, which in this text is known in a number of ways, but as Brahman. So he's going to teach them about who you are, what's ultimate reality, and once you know those things, you will resolve your dilemma. If you don't know the answers to those, you're just going to sit like Hamlet and forever just say, what's it all about? So he teaches him the true understanding of the individual, and once you have that, you will be liberated spiritually. Thus, the Gita affirms that the self, or the Atman, is eternal. The Atman, however, is not the ego. The ego is that part of yourself that identifies solely with your own needs, desires, wants, attitudes, etc. That is not your Atman. That is your ego. But beneath that is your Atman. That is eternal. That is everlasting, according to Hindu thought. So he's teaching him this. So in chapter 2, this knowledge is revealed. So let us look at the text. Seeing Arjuna full of compassion and very sorrowful, his eyes brimming with tears, Krishna spoke the following words. My dear Arjuna, how have these impurities come upon you? He's caught. He can't act. If you know the story of Hamlet, that's the same. Hamlet gets into that position. He can't act. He's stuck. Okay? They are not at all befitting a man who knows the progressive values of life. Do not yield to this degrading impotence. It does not become you. Give up this weakness of heart and arise and do your duty. Arjuna said, but, O Krishna, how can I counterattack with arrows in battle men that I have known who are worthy of my worship? Is it better to live in this world by begging than to live at the cost of lives of great souls? If they are killed, our spoils will be tainted. Please instruct me. So he still doesn't get it. And that's often the way these texts work. First time doesn't work. Any teachers here? Yeah, generally, first time students tend to. Okay. So, at this time, Krishna, smiling in the midst of both armies, spoke the following words to the grief-stricken Arjuna. While speaking learned words, you are mourning for what is not worthy of grief. Those who are wise lament neither for the living nor the dead. And this is the important line. Never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you. Nor all these kings or all these arrayed in battle. What exists at Arjuna's level? The ego. What Krishna is saying is the Atman never dies, it's never born. It's eternal. Because it's one with the ultimate reality. Once you understand this connection, according to Krishna, the world will look differently. How do we tend to see it? How does Arjuna tend to see it? Everything's separate, individual. Things come, they're born, they die. This circle. In Hinduism, that's called samsara, the circle of life. Krishna is saying, when you only see existence on that level, you're not seeing the truth. You're seeing the surface. You're seeing the top of the ocean rather than its depths. Once you understand your proper connection, your problems will go away. Okay. So the implication is that the idea of death and birth are both illusions brought about by the lack of true knowledge. As the embodied soul can, then he says to Arjuna, as the embodied soul continually passes in this body from boyhood to youth to old age, similarly it passes into another body at death. So what idea is introduced here? Reincarnation. So here we find the doctrine of reincarnation, or the idea that the Atman passes from one body to the next over a series of lives. We just think here and now. What Krishna is saying, things are much bigger and larger than you think. The universe is much bigger, and which we now know, and larger than you think. It's much more expansive. There's so much more going on that you cannot grasp up here. The problem is we think we can grasp it all up here, and then we get ourselves into these terrible dilemmas which philosophy tries to figure out and never does. Yeah. So in any way, so this is the doctrine of reincarnation. And he also explains that unlike the Atman, the human ego, with its ideas and feelings about reality, is impermanent. Reality is impermanent. I mean, that's not hard to figure out, is it? Is anything permanent? Not in samsara, not in the world of phenomena. Everything's always changing. So this is the distinction that's being made here. If you live out there, you're always living in the world of transition and change, and then you get attached to that, and what happens? You suffer. You want something to remain that by definition cannot remain. But, and this is the big but for Hindus, there is something underneath all of it that is permanent, but it's not your ego. It's your Atman, which is your true self, but it's not what we tend to think of as me. The image that's often used is like the ocean and the wave. You are the wave. Waves have separate form. What happens to each wave eventually? Crashes. But does it not exist? It goes back into the ocean. Because the wave is really, ultimately, the water. The wave is just a certain form or manifestation of the water. So if you look at your notion of self in a similar way, your idea of individual Dave Bratz is a wave. It's going to, it's going to eventually break. And that's for all of us, right? But the underlying essence, which is Dave, which is his Atman, is always there. Now, just think, if you look at the world that way, would you act differently, do you think? If you saw everything that's phenomenal as transitory and not ultimate, but something beneath it that is, why would you put so much, and isn't this said in the gospel, why would you build something on sand? That's the same notion. Why build your house on sand? What's going to happen to it eventually? Okay. Build it on rock. Okay. Similar sort of idea. And that's one of the purposes of these classes, as far as I'm concerned, to show that there are underlying ideas in most of the religions that are similar. Different symbol systems, perhaps, different devotional patterns. But if you look deeply at all these, you can see that message can be found in just about every religion. Okay? The phenomenal world is passing. Yeah. So, and so ideas and feelings come and go, just like winter and summer. And this is because they are a result of sense perceptions, which only tell you about the surface. It's not that you shouldn't have sense perceptions. You shouldn't, and it isn't saying you don't live in the practical world. You do, but you also recognize what it is in the final analysis. It's a practical world that comes and goes. So the enlightened individual, one with knowledge, or jnana, sees things for what they are. And that such knowledge is necessary to get off the wheel. We're on a wheel. It's called samsara. Maya means illusion, by the way. We live in Maya. We live in illusion from this perspective. Now, it's not that it's not there really at the moment, but it's not there what? Permanently. It's like if you go see a magic show. Okay? What looks like is real and real. Yeah? That's a similar sort of thing that's being said. Underneath is reality. On the surface is this sort of illusion, which we live in, and it's okay, you can live in that and you can enjoy it, but recognize it for what it is in the ultimate analysis. Because if you get stuck at that level, well, then you're stuck. And you'll be caught on this endless wheel of samsara. Not only in this lifetime, but in the next one, and the next one, and the next one, until you decide what? Time to get off of this thing. Okay? How many Super Bowls can you win? Okay? After ultimately it's the notion you want to get back to your home, your underlying unity with the oneness of the universe. That's what, and I think that's, well, as I said, what does religion mean? Religio, to reconnect. It's in Latin, ligament. You want to reconnect with your ultimate source. Krishna then makes connection between knowing and doing. Because remember, what is Arjuna's big question? What should I do? Once you know this, then you can act. because you recognize that you're acting not out of connection or desire to control anything, but to do what is right. Notice the battle is between good guys and bad guys. Makes it a little bit easier. But once you know that, then you act, and you can fight, but you're not fighting because out of anger or to hurt anyone. You're fighting because you have to protect righteousness. And underneath it all, it's all unified anyway. Now, some might say that's a bit of a cop-out, and maybe it is. In other words, what is being said is you can't really kill anyone. You can kill their ego, but you can't kill their what? Atman. Okay. So, that's one path. There's another path, and that's known as karma yoga. Karma means action. Okay. So this is the path of action. The first path was the path of knowledge. Okay. This is called the path of action. And what Krishna reveals to Arjuna in the Gita is that it is karma that binds us to this wheel. Our karma binds us. Because what does our karma do? It attaches. Once you attach to something, you're caught. And this is what karma does. So it's not so much that action in itself is a problem, but the psychological connections that we give that action. Action in itself is neutral. It's when we attach ideas to that action that are often limited ideas, self-centered ideas, either from the ego or from the tribe. When you do that, you're stuck in this endless, violent action of karma. So, what does the Gita say? The Gita says you can act, but don't be attached. That's not easy. Okay? So you can act, you have to act, we all have to act. The problem is when we become emotionally attached. The phrase that's used is act, but don't expect the fruit of your action. Don't act for some other reason than the action itself. In other words, for Arjuna, you're not acting to make yourself a great warrior or to stand up and be applauded. You're acting because you're doing what is right. And you're not attached to something beyond that. It's the righteousness that allows you to fight. Not your connectedness to the outcome of that. So it's how do you act without caring about the result? We're not trained that way. The best way of looking at it, perhaps, is sports. What if you just played to play? And in the end, you didn't really care who won. You just enjoyed the playing. And whoever wins, wins, and whoever... We don't play that way, do we? You don't win, you're no good. Okay? So this is the notion. In the karma yoga path, yes, you must act in the world, but act in a detached manner. Act in a detached manner. It's often said that desire, which is action that is connected, is endless. Desire is never fulfilled. You ever notice that? Let's say you like something, ice cream, you eat it. Your desire is filled for what? Till tomorrow? Then you want another ice cream. Okay? It's continual. There's no end to desire. That's the notion here. It's like a glass with a hole in the bottom. Keep pouring the water in and it keeps going out. So this is what Krishna says. Whoever in acting, now this is important, dedicates his actions to the Supreme Spirit and puts aside all selfish interest in the result is untouched by sin. Even as the leaf of the lotus is unaffected by the waters. Lotus is often used as a symbol. It's this beautiful plant, but what's underneath it usually? Muck. It grows out of mud. Okay? Thich Nhat Hanh used to say, no mud, no lotus. But in any case, the truly devoted for the purification of the heart perform actions with their bodies, their minds, their understanding, and their senses, putting away all self-interest. Act, but don't be self-centered about it. Do it because it's right, not because you get anything out of it. The man who is devoted and not attached to the fruit of the action obtains tranquility and peace of mind. While he who through desire has attachment for the fruit of action is bound down thereby. How many guys are still suffering over losing the game last week? Yeah. Yeah. I grew up a Ram fan. And for days afterwards, because they always lost when I was growing up, I would be kind of, out of it. And you read, this is going on right now. Fans of the Dallas Cowboys. They're devastated because they didn't win a football game. So this is the notion. Play, enjoy it, do your best, congratulate the winner, have fun. But once you get attached, then you got to win. And if you have to win, things follow on from that. So that's the notion of karma yoga. So there's that path, and then there's what's known as bhakti yoga. That's the third path. That's the path of devotion. It involves the cultivation and love of devotion to God. Bhakti is about loving the eternal. If you love the eternal, what happens to all your phenomenal loves? They get put into the proper hierarchy. Doesn't mean you can't love individuals, but what has to be priority is loving the supreme, because ultimately, if you go back to jnana yoga, the supreme is in where? All of us. So when you love the supreme in the proper way, you will love everyone, because we all share that Atman. So this is the path known as bhakti yoga. It's motivated only for the desire to love, not to get anything in return. If you're trying to get something in return, you're not loving. If you're truly loving, it's done without any desire to have something in return. It's this spiritual liberation or enlightenment with the attainment of oneness with God. How do you become one with God? This path says through loving, devoted action. When you love God, you will become one with God. Because you won't be always asking what? What's in it for me? You love because you love. And it's generally called the easiest path, because anyone can do that. I mean, you don't have to have great knowledge. You don't have to be a great warrior, a great anything. Anyone can love God. That's the notion. So this is when you speak of the Gita, most people think of devotion to Krishna, because Krishna becomes the symbol of God here. Okay, so that's the text. And like I said, here's the text. Here's one commentary. And there have been tons of commentaries written just on the Gita, let alone all the other texts. So let me just mention a couple of these to give you an idea. One of the famous commentaries is written by, by the way, it says at the end of the Gita, all three paths lead to liberation. So which one best fits you? Some of us are more thinkers. Some of us are more, quote unquote, mystical. Some of us are more active in the world. Some of us just love. All three of those will get you there if they're done with purity of heart. That's the point. All three paths lead to the ultimate. Okay, so the most famous commentary was written by this man. His name is Adi Shankara, 788 to 820 CE. He'd be sort of the equivalent of St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas put together. He's written numerous volumes on just about every text, and one very much on the Gita. He emphasized jnana yoga. See what these different commentaries, why you have so many commentaries, when you have these three paths, some people like one path better than the other. Some commentators will focus on, so they will explain the text as, well, jnana yoga is superior, the others are there. Someone else will say, no, karma yoga is superior, and they'll give their reasons. And then others will say, no, bhakti yoga is superior, and will give. Well, Shankara gave jnana yoga as the true knowledge of the Atman is what is most important. And because that Atman is ultimately one with that Brahman or God. Okay? So this is what he said. This is what the text is really trying to teach you. That your ultimate, deepest soul is one with the ultimate of reality. You are part of the ocean. You're not separate from it. What makes you think you're separate are your senses and your ideas. What do ideas do, by the way? They separate. That's the definition. I have an idea of something because it's different than something else. So that's knowledge on this level. Shankara says the Gita is really teaching jnana yoga. This whole world of manifestation, multiplicity is not real in itself. It's only real for a moment. And it will pass. Moment after moment after moment after moment. We think it's real until we get to a point when we begin to realize, well, maybe it isn't real. Okay? This condition of ignorance, it's called avidya. Avidya is ignorance. When your soul is filled with avidya, you will not understand this. And you will live on the level of phenomena only. And that will cause you problems. So he focuses on jnana. He holds that while action is essential, it will eventually fall away without proper knowledge. Your action, according to Shankara, proper action only follows after proper knowledge. If you don't know the situation, your action will not resolve any. It'll probably make it worse. Okay? If you don't know the truth of a situation and then act on the ignorance of that, what's going to be the result? Probably not good. So there's this famous saying that comes from Shankara. It's called Tat Tvam Asi in Sanskrit. Thou art that, or you are it. You being your Atman, it or that being the supreme ultimate reality. You are one with it. Now remember, this isn't about ego. That's where people get confused. Am I God? No, your ego isn't. But underneath, we all share that unifying spiritual reality, which is the oneness called Brahman. That's what you realize. And when you realize that, you don't act egotistically. You act universally, because you see it's in all people. So sometimes you are that. What do you mean? No, it's not ego. Remember that. It's not your separate individual mind ego. It's your underlying spiritual essence, which is Atman. And so he calls this God Brahman. And he says, this Brahman really doesn't have qualities. Like when we think of God, we give God qualities. Omniscient, all-powerful, all-loving, all this. Brahman is beyond all that. Kind of like the Old Testament God. You couldn't even name God, let alone say anything about him. Or it. See, language is a problem, isn't it? I say about him. Okay? Automatically, my language has limited. In any case, it's only pure. Now, why this is important is he doesn't hold very much for bhakti, for devotion. You see why? Because his God isn't something that is loved and loves back. It's beyond that. That doesn't mean you don't love, but these are the sort of differences that appear in the different commentaries. Another great commentary is by this gentleman by name of Ramanuja. He was in the 11th century CE. Shankara says the world is what? Illusory? Doesn't exist? No. And this is good. This is good because it shows you different commentaries and interpretations. He says, no, the world's very real. It's real. It's not an illusion. And the highest vision of reality is a personal God, known as Vishnu. Don't you find this fascinating, that you can have this one text, and one person can say the ultimate understanding of this text is jnana, or no personal God. Another says, no, it's about a personal God. There are interpretations. Any tradition has various interpretations, and they all have great arguments. They all have great arguments. So he says, no, it's God is Vishnu, who different than Shankara. He says, and this God has attributes. This God is loving. This God cares. So you can have that sort of relationship with Vishnu. And that's what the Gita is all about, according to Ramanuja. And it's that connection of lovingness that gets you out of your ego and allows you to be saved or have salvation. And he says, in fact, the ego isn't unreal. It's real. You know that. You experience that. Why do we call it unreal? The point is to just make sure that that ego loves Vishnu, not itself. But I find this fascinating, how you can have these two different. And then how does Vishnu relate to you? Well, Vishnu creates the universe. So Vishnu has created you. This is a wonderful myth. Do you see Vishnu sitting up there? Can you see that? What's coming out of his belly button? There's a lotus. Out of the lotus is a small little god, another god, who creates the universe. So the myth is that for millions of years, Vishnu sleeps, there's nothing. Then he wakes up. Out of his belly button comes the lotus. Out of the lotus comes the creator god Brahma, who creates the universe that lasts for millions and millions and millions of years, and then the process reverses itself. Brahma goes back into the lotus goes back into the belly button, Vishnu sleeps. And that just keeps going. It's the cycle. So this cosmos, it's interesting. Modern physics is getting kind of close to this. This might be only one universe that we're experiencing now, that started 8 billion years ago. But there were probably others. Yeah, one thing about Hindu thought, it early on noticed things that were large. Large time periods. A kalpa was 8 million years. You remember, it was only in the 19th century that in the West they were still arguing whether the universe was 6,000 years old. So yeah, this is, so do you see the difference here? It's a creator God that you can worship. There's something, Vishnu is within you, but he's not identical with you. Now that gets, maybe that's a bit of a theological, but Shankara said it's identical. The ocean is the wave. Ramanuja says, no. There's a difference. And you will always be separate to some degree, and that's what love is for. Love is between two separate entities. Okay, we're having fun? So he then develops his own cosmology. And then the third, this is what he called Antaryaman. That's the Vishnu within you, but it's not you. It's within you, but it's not you. Theological distinction, yes. Then there's his idea that Krishna is the avatar of Vishnu. So it's really Vishnu. It's very close to Jesus and God in the Trinity. Okay. Krishna is, if you want to put, is like Jesus in this tradition. Now, the last one is this is fairly new. You may have heard of this man's group. This is, his last name is Prabhupada, Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. You ever heard of the Hare Krishna movement? This is the guy who brought it to the United States. Okay. The position here is that the Gita teaches only really one thing that's important: total love of Krishna. You ever heard this? Have a personal relationship with Krishna? You may have heard have a personal relationship with Jesus in the devotional aspects of Christianity. You ever heard praise songs? Okay, you have a personal, well, this is very much part of another tradition of the Gita. It's calling you to have a personal relationship with Krishna. And who is Krishna? God in human form, an avatar. It goes back, though, it's not something new. It goes back to this gentleman, 16th century. So when you hear people saying Hare Krishna is something new, no. It's been around since the 16th century. This was a Bengali saint by the name of Chaitanya. Interesting story. He was an intellect. He was a philosopher. He was at a university. And one day he gave it all up. He said, these books are worth nothing. There's only one thing that's worthwhile. And he started chanting Krishna's name. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. And that's where the Hare Krishna comes from. When you're doing that, you are putting yourself emotionally in a complete devotional relationship to Krishna. Nothing else matters in the final analysis. And it does, if you ever, it doesn't have to be Hare Krishna, go home and chant anything for an hour. Yeah. It does something to the brain. In any case, so this is the notion where the bhakti tradition takes over totally. You totally worship Krishna and you chant his name. Chaitanya he used to walk around India to all the pilgrimage sites chanting Hare Krishna. Now, if I said to you, the goal of your life is just to chant Jesus' name, we'd probably say, no, wait a second. There must be something more important than that. Chaitanya says, what could be more important than being in love with God? And having that feeling that that's all that's important. Anyway, so those are three traditions that are commentaries on the Gita. The last thing I want to mention are two, I should mention this, but at one point Arjuna says to Krishna, who are you really? And Krishna says, I am God. I'm Vishnu. He says, prove it. And Krishna opens his mouth. Have you seen the Hubble telescope or the Webb telescope, how that universe? That's what Arjuna sees in Krishna's mouth. It's called the universal form. He says, show me, come on, show me that you're God. And he does. And what does it do to Arjuna? It overwhelms him. I mean, suddenly the whole universe, and he says, return to your human form. And he does. But he now gets the insight. So when you're worshiping Krishna, you're worshiping God. I mean, that's what you're doing. Okay, I did want to mention just two other texts that are related to the Gita, and they're related over this concept of fighting and violence. Okay. The first is by this gentleman here. His name is Tilak. He was, his full name is Bal Gandhara Tilak. He wrote a commentary on the Gita from his prison cell in Burma. Why was he in a prison cell in Burma? Who put him there? The British. He was a revolutionary, trying to get rid of British rule in India. He turned to the Gita to justify violence against the British. You see how that might fit? Who are the British? They're the Kauravas. Who are the Indian nationalists? They're the Pandavas. You have the right to fight for a righteous cause, even if that includes violence. So he wrote a whole commentary on the Gita in which the underlying notion is righteous violence, or what in the West we call a just war. There's been, it goes all the way back to St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, texts that legitimize violence in certain circumstances, and those are usually outlined. That was Tilak's interpretation of the Gita. Who had a 180-degree opposite interpretation? Gandhi. Gandhi said the Gita is about non-violent action. Do you see how he might come to that from what we said? When you're acting violently, you're definitely attached. And if the Gita is about non-attached action, then you can't act violently. Yeah, Chris? Arjuna in the text, well, it kind of leaves it, yeah. It says, okay, he agrees and he does his duty. Yes, and that's what Tilak would say. Tilak would say he did his duty, he fought. Now, what does Gandhi do with this? He says, well, you got to understand that the text and the war isn't about some external battle. It's about an internal battle. It's the battle of the soul. It's the battle that we go through every day to get beyond our individual egos. In Islam, it's called jihad, the internal jihad, where you're fighting against those things that are taking you away from the true path. Generally self-centered, egotistical, lust, whatever you want to call it. Okay? That's where Gandhi arrives. He says the text is really about non-violent action. That if you're acting violently, by definition, you're attached. Which is right? Or who is right? Go home and decide. I mean, these are interpretations. And that's what's important, I think, to understand. All these texts have different interpretations. Where religion becomes problematic, in my mind, is when it buys one interpretation and says no other interpretation is valid or correct, and if you don't follow my interpretation, you're wrong with a capital W. Okay? Now, you could be wrong, but there are interpretations. So wouldn't it be a much better world religiously if we allowed for different interpretations and acted nonviolently? See, we have this need to be right. You know, and that's about psychological power at some degree. If we could sort of back off of that a bit and say, if we're honest, we don't know. We believe, and that's fine. And we have arguments, and that's fine. But does anyone have the final answer to everything? No. Now, you may say the text does, but then you have to do what? You got to interpret it. So that's what all these interpretations are ultimately about. So Gandhi ended up arguing against violence. Now, did he not stand up to the British? Oh, yes, he did. Yes, he did. It was called satyagraha. Means holding fast to truth. What Gandhi said is you don't back off from conflict. You accept that there will be conflict, but you do it nonviolently. Even if that means what? Taking it on the head. In fact, he argued, whether this is true or not, that when that happens, you take the morally superior position, and this is the question, your opposition will recognize that. So, for example, at this great satyagraha, which is called the salt satyagraha, where they were opposing the British taxation on salt, They went to the salt mills. Has anyone seen the movie Gandhi? Remember where they're lined up and they're getting beat and they're just pulling them away. He believed that this had power. I think it's somewhat similar to Jesus' notion of turn the other cheek, take on the suffering yourself. There's some power in suffering. We don't like it, but there's often a power there, especially when it's used in conflictual terms. Okay, that sort of gets us to the end of tonight. Next week, Reverend Albert will be back, and he'll be talking about New Testament text and commentaries, etc., etc. And then in the final week, I'll finish up with Quran, a similar sort of approach, looking at the text, what it says, and the various commentaries. There's something in Islam called hadith, which again is sort of at this sort of relationship. Okay, any questions, thoughts? Yeah, Keith.
So if you basically did everything without expecting a certain outcome, and no ego, no competition, I mean, where would Henry Ford and Elon Musk be? And you can say all the fruits of all this come and go, but people's lives are a lot better for it. We don't drive covered wagons anymore, so.
I think someone like, and Gandhi opted for village life as opposed to modern society. He said, yeah, but see, Gandhi has an eternal view of things. So, okay, it might be good here for a while, but what's it doing to your soul? That's eternal. The rest, well, yeah, you can have a great, successful life here, and that's fine. But there's something more important. And when it comes to having to choose, perhaps, between those, he would choose the eternal.
And didn't Martin Luther King do that?
Yeah. I think most great religious thinker, I mean, their goal isn't worldly. That doesn't mean you have to be an ascetic and not have any, but ultimately your goal isn't worldly. Because it doesn't take a lot of, what happens ultimately worldly? I don't care if you're a billionaire or a pauper. As it said, you end up in the same place. And what goes on in between, it might be seeming more important now than it really is. Think of how important you thought things were when you were 10. Where's that now? That's the notion. There's something in religious thought, for better or for worse, that transcends this world of what Hindus call samsara, or what
sometimes in Christianity is called the veil of tears. Yeah. Veil meaning, the religious position is if you lose the perspective of the transcendent eternal, you're stuck with this. And where do you go from there? And religion can do that as well. Yeah. Anyway, it is, sure. And, are we just speaking in such abstractions that we prefer to live in villages rather than have our BMWs and TVs and such? Well, there's been some interesting studies about which people are happier. The more you have, the more you have to lose. You ever realize that? I mean, even I live in a gated community, not by choice, but that was offered to me when I got here. A gated community. Yeah, good for me. But still, what does that say? It says I'm safe, but in being safe, what do I have to do? I have to close myself off because of the world. Anyway, good question though, Keith. And I think you can always say, yes, Gandhi was an idealist. It depends on what your goal is. And if your goal is a transcendent goal, then what happens here is always secondary. If you don't have a transcendent goal, then what's here is primary. And then where do you go from there?
Yeah, I'm not promoting, greed. I understand. I'm just saying, comfort.
Yeah,
comfort.
Yeah, and there's something for comfort, no doubt. Yeah, I'm not arguing against comfort. It's not like you don't do anything.
Is comfort become your God? That's the question. Is that what you all? Is that the only? Is that your? To use Tilla, is that your ultimate concern? If it is, then your life will be lived in a certain way. Everything will be based ultimately on whether you're comfortable. Which is, I'm not arguing against that, but that tends to be not quote unquote a religious position, because the religious position says ultimately your goal is transcendent. I'm not saying one is right or one is wrong. I'm just trying to evaluate that. If your ultimate goal is comfort, or if your ultimate goal is winning football games, your life will, whatever your ultimate goal is, that will direct your life. Okay. And again, I'm not telling you what your ultimate goal is. I don't preach. I try not to. Any other comments? Don?
I was thinking about that, that eternal, never-ending connection we see as our spirit.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. In the West, we'd call it the Holy Spirit within us. It was called the Antiyaman by Ramanuja. We have this eternal spirit within us. Jnana Yoga says we really know this. Not at a knowledge level of facts or 1 + 1 = 2. A deep intuitive knowledge that I am. It is. It's sort of an intuition. You don't get up each morning and prove to yourself that you exist, do you? No. And that is the notion that that's not just within you. It's actually, Hinduism says it's within everything. So, okay, next week, Reverend Albert will be back, and we'll move on to the next group of texts. Thanks for coming.